Russia's military might is nothing more than a myth. For centuries, the West feared the so-called Russian bear. But today, that fear has been shattered. Russia's disastrous campaigns in Ukraine, the outdated equipment, and poor leadership have exposed its armed forces as weak, chaotic, and no match for a true superpower. And when it comes to military strength, no one comes close to the United States. So how does America stay so far ahead? It starts with logistics. At first glance, you might think Russia has the advantage in a war fought in Eastern Europe. It's in their backyard after all. But logistics win wars, and the US has spent decades mastering the art of moving troops and supplies across oceans and continents. This isn't just a theory, it's baked into how the US military operates. Consider this: for every combat soldier, the US military has 10 support soldiers. That's the kind of logistical backbone Russia can only dream of. Meanwhile, Russia has embarrassed itself on the logistics front. Remember that 40-mile convoy that stalled outside Kyiv in early 2022? Trucks broke down, tires shredded, and corrupt officers sold off vital supplies. It was a logistical nightmare and a perfect preview of Russia's weaknesses. Even today, Russia's logistics remain shaky. The country relies heavily on rail networks to sustain its forces in Ukraine. That might work for now, but those rail lines are prime targets, and as Ukraine has shown, they can be taken out with precision strikes. Imagine what the US could do with its advanced missile systems and intelligence networks. But logistics isn't the only area where Russia falls short. Training and doctrine are other glaring weaknesses. While the US transitioned to a fully professional military in the 1970s, Russia still relies on conscription. Every able-bodied man between 18 and 30 is required to serve for a year, but only 2% of conscripts stay on to become professionals. This means Russia lacks a professional corps of non-commissioned officers, the backbone of any effective fighting force. Instead, junior officers are forced to handle tasks that their American counterparts delegate to NCOs. This increases risk, leads to higher casualties, and causes Russian units to lose effectiveness faster. And then there's doctrine. The US military's air-land battle doctrine, perfected during Operation Desert Storm, is all about overwhelming the enemy across every domain: land, air, sea, and more. It's a masterclass in modern warfare. Here's how it works. Imagine an F-35 stealth fighter sneaking behind enemy lines and spotting a high-value target, a supply depot, a rail hub, or a command center. Instead of engaging directly, it relays the target coordinates to a HIMARS system or a Navy ship offshore. Moments later, the target is destroyed, and the F-35 moves on to find the next. Now compare that to Russia. Its top-heavy command structure and poor communications make it slow to adapt and easy to disrupt. When HIMARS strikes severed links to Russian command centers in Ukraine, entire units froze, paralyzed by indecision. Russia's attempts to fix these problems have been reactive at best. They moved command posts further back, buried them underground, and reinforced them with concrete. But these stopgap measures don't solve the core issues. They just delay the inevitable. Russia has tried to learn some of these lessons, but it's not a good student. The big thing it's lacking is the communications effectiveness the United States has. The US military has invested a lot of money in building precise and secure communications and data links between its various platforms. These systems are so good that weapons in the process of flying downrange can talk to each other. Consider the new AGM-158C long-range anti-ship missile. These projectiles can talk to each other when fired in a volley to make sure that they aren't targeting the same thing. They can even change their target priorities in the face of resistance. If one of them gets knocked out by the enemy air defenses, another can take over the strike on the target that its fallen comrade had once been flying toward, maybe because it was more important. Less spectacularly, the comms net allows the US military to coordinate all arms together securely, avoiding a repetition of the embarrassing errors that have led to so many Russian flag officers losing their lives in an invasion that was supposed to last a few days. There are also multiple layers to ensure the comms net survives a modern electronic warfare environment. Units are issued local, long-range, and satellite radios. There are even Air Force combat controllers embedded with ground troops that can get live streams from aircraft overhead. There is a drawback to this: too many cooks in the kitchen maybe. The Pentagon has tried to consolidate these different systems into a one-size-fits-all replacement, but the effort has been a failure so far. Better than Russia though, because Russia isn't good at doing any of these things. Its troops have often relied on unencrypted radios or civilian cell phone networks to talk to each other, and naturally, those signals are easily intercepted. It doesn't help that senior officers and even the manufacturers of encrypted communications equipment, like the ASAT radio, came under investigation for embezzling funds in 2021. Unsurprisingly, these radios were in short supply when the invasion began the following year. Communications networks aren't the only less than modern way Russia fights its wars. It still fights in the way the Soviet Union did, going back to before World War II. when it tried to learn what it thought were the most important lessons from the First World War. The Soviet response was to continue to emphasize its big guns and send in tanks, a lot of tanks, seeking to employ overwhelming force to open a breach in the enemy defenses that can be exploited for hundreds of miles. This is called the deep battle doctrine. This aspect of Russian warfare does reveal one important area that Russia might be able to hold its own against the United States, and it's a very important one: artillery. For all the talk about a 21st century revolution in military affairs, the war in Ukraine has looked much more like the World Wars or conflicts from even earlier than it has Star Wars. Artillery has been responsible for 80% of the casualties on both sides, and because Russia is a land power, it has a tradition of emphasizing artillery a lot. The Global Firepower Index estimates that Russia has 6,208 self-propelled artillery pieces, 8,356 towed artillery, and 3,065 MLRS systems, for a total of 17,629. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Russia's superiority in artillery is the one thing that's allowed it to stay in the war. In contrast, the United States only has an estimated 1,595 self-propelled artillery pieces, 1,267 towed artillery, and 694 MLRS, a total of 3,556. The RAND Corporation warned in 2019 that the United States' reliance on air support and focus on counterterrorism had contributed to the deterioration of American artillery capability, and that in a conflict with Russia, it would be outnumbered, outranged, and face resistance to target acquisition. A grim assessment. But Russia's performance in Ukraine has revealed weaknesses of its own. Russia began the war in Ukraine by using World War II-style artillery bombardments. That's not to say that this saturation fire was ineffective. On the tactical level, it certainly worked, as it worked in Grozny and Syria before. Russian dictators like Putin typically don't care much for civilian casualties. The problem was that this strategy wasted a lot of ammunition. Because of the massive depletion of ammunition, Russia has become partially reliant on North Korean shells. Unsurprisingly, there are frequent complaints about them. Russian troops say they are often firing duds, and when they aren't, the North Korean shells are inaccurate, lack range, and are accident-prone. Russia began using more laser-guided Krasnopol shells to conserve ammunition, but its artillery remains poorly coordinated. How poorly? Despite the defensive advantage of extensive fortifications in the 2023 Zaporizhzhia campaign, Russian forces suffered significant losses due to Ukraine's superior artillery tactics, including highly accurate counter-battery fire. Russia's slow artillery response and poorly trained gunners continue to hinder its effectiveness on the battlefield. Russia has lost a visually confirmed 419 towed artillery, 857 self-propelled artillery, and 445 MLRS systems as of December 7, 2024. It's relying on increasingly older systems to replace them. It's also been firing so many shells that it's yanking off gun barrels from old systems and putting them on the newer ones. This isn't a good idea if you want to have accurate fire support. And there's problems in the organization of the Russian artillery. Russia organizes its units into battalion tactical groups. Each BTG has between 600 and 800 combat troops supported by air defenses, artillery, engineering, tanks, and logistical support units. The BTG is Russia's answer to combined arms warfare, and on paper it looks good. The problem is that it actually divides Russia's artillery forces and makes it more difficult for it to coordinate its firepower. This was a key reason for its inability to take advantage of its fire superiority when it was at its height early in the war. In contrast, the United States is moving its artillery from the brigade combat team level to the divisional level as part of its bid to be more effective against a peer competitor. This shift will allow it to better concentrate and coordinate its firepower in an electronic warfare environment. The Pentagon expects the shift to be complete by 2030. So while Russia has superiority in the number of artillery systems, the United States' allotment of weapons reveals its combined arms approach to warfare. Against much more accurate counter-battery fire, electronic warfare, and effective air support, Russia's approach to artillery warfare will be even less successful, although it would undoubtedly create casualty figures the American public has not seen in living memory. After the big guns fire, Russia's goal is to send in wave after wave of tanks against its enemy to break them. NATO planners long feared Soviet armored columns, a fear that persisted even after the Cold War. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia claimed to have the world's largest tank fleet with over 12,500 units. However, thousands of these have since been destroyed, revealing critical vulnerabilities in Russia's designs and tactics. The thing is, though, Russia doesn't use its tanks well. They are unsupported by infantry, lack proper recovery vehicles to bail them out if they get damaged or stuck, and they haven't been good at adapting to drones. Tank for tank, they are inferior to their American counterparts, and this isn't just a theory. American Abrams tanks encountered the same tanks the Russians now use way back in Desert Storm and decisively defeated them. In one of the largest tank battles of the 20th century, the Battle of Norfolk, hundreds of Iraqi tanks were destroyed for the price of a few coalition tanks that were mostly the victims of friendly fire in the chaotic conditions. Against modern Abrams tanks properly supported by infantry, there's no reason to think that the Russians would fare any better than the Iraqis did. But there has been a change since the Gulf War. Tanks have typically not engaged one another directly in Ukraine. Most of them have been destroyed by shoulder-fired weapons, drones, or artillery before they get into range to shoot at each other. The Russian tanks and artillery would face another problem there. The United States means what it says about the air-land doctrine, and that means an emphasis on air dominance. It has by far the world's largest number of military aircraft, with about 13,300 as of 2022. The world's most formidable air fleet belongs to the United States Air Force. Coming in at number 2 is not Russia or China, but the United States Navy. Russia lagged far behind, with 3,864 total military aircraft. Hundreds of those have since been destroyed. Russia boasts that it has a fifth-generation fighter jet, the Su-57, but a lot of people don't think so. Its stealth features are concentrated on the front, so if it maneuvers to the side or rear, it's a lot more detectable to radar compared to America's F-22 and F-35. But what good is a supposedly stealth plane if the communications aren't secure? Remember the Russian radio problem? It extends to the skies too. It's so bad that Russian strategic bombers have been forced to use civilian communications networks. Good luck keeping your stealth profile with that. But it's not just the cutting-edge stuff. In the skies, the United States outnumbers Russia with better pilots and more modernized fourth-generation aircraft. In a fully fledged confrontation, the United States has tools that the Russians can't bring to the table, like stealth bombers that can penetrate deep within enemy airspace and destroy vital targets that other weapon systems can't reach. The Russians have no such arm to do the same. When looking at the two air fleets, it's impossible to imagine that the United States would not quickly establish control of the skies. In fact, many of America's aircraft, like the F-22 Raptor and F-15 Eagle, were designed to crush the Russians in the skies over Europe. Just think about it like this. Russia failed to dominate the skies against a much weaker air force in Ukraine. It hasn't even been able to use aviation to force Ukraine out of its own territory months after its troops arrived. With effective American aviation, Russia's tank fleet and other ground forces would be hard-pressed to be effective. Russia understands this problem and has invested heavily in its air defenses, like the S-400, which it says can supposedly target America's stealth aircraft, but there's no good evidence to back up these claims. Turkey was so dissatisfied with its S-400 that it accused Russia of fraud for selling a defective product. Specifically, its radar performed less effectively than the Russians claimed, especially against low-flying aircraft, and wasn't good in poor weather. The Turks were using fourth-generation aircraft in these tests. The conclusion is hard to escape that Russia's air defense network would perform inadequately against America's best planes, and the breach opens up from there. Russia's aircraft can't even provide good close air support, as most of its fleet lacks the targeting pods it needs to get the job done. Russia has been hesitant to use its aircraft to effectively support its ground troops in Ukraine. Normally, you hear that it fears losing them, but this is another reason why. On the other hand, the United States has hundreds of aircraft that can provide such support, and it can swap on a targeting pod for this purpose to aircraft that don't have them right now. It could even do this for an Abrams tank if it wanted to, although trying to fly a tank would be innovative even for the United States. And it's not just high-tech systems like tanks, planes, and air defenses. Russia struggles to properly equip its infantry too. Many Russian troops lack proper body armor, with reports of corruption among officers selling it off. Their helmets are poorly designed, limiting compatibility with modern gear like night vision, which remains rare among dismounted Russian troops. Even their rifles face challenges with optics, as the new mounting system for optics doesn't fit with older stock, leaving many soldiers without proper sights for their weapons. This is why the United States prefers to conduct its operations at night. Its units retain situational awareness while its enemies are literally in the dark. This advantage extends to America's armored units too. For Russia, only elite units can match what is standard kit for their American counterparts. So in any night engagement, the United States would have a decisive advantage. Oh, and they'll have proper body armor to keep them alive when enemy fire comes downrange. Russian troops often lack even this. The United States' equipment advantage has grown since Russia started the war. Sanctions have ensured that modern electronic components cannot easily get into Russian factories. Optics, fire control, and communications equipment are now a lot harder to come by. Russia has been able to import some components from China, but these aren't on the same level as the Western components that it was using before the war. Most of this equipment has since been destroyed. These sanctions aren't going anywhere anytime soon, so Russia is in an even worse position to fight against the US military than it was before 2022. Russia can pretend to be a superpower all it wants, but there's no better truth serum than an actual combat record. Whether you look at the Russian equipment Iraq used in the Gulf War, Russia's performance in the Chechen Wars, or the recent war in Ukraine, Russia's military and the stuff it uses has repeatedly proven that it's not up to the task of facing down American military might. But what do you think? Don't forget to let us know in the comments, and also make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out how are US soldiers different from Russian soldiers, or click this other video instead.